Welcome everybody. It's a little bit over 3 o'clock. Welcome to another online Hot Politics Lab. I am very happy to introduce you today, Professor Leonie Huddy, who's a professor at Stony Brook University. And today, Leonie, I actually learned you are a trained zoologist. And so you have studied animals for a long period of time, and but you've really specialized on one particular type of animal, and that's the human being. Professor Huddy is really one of the leading political psychologists in the field, has had seminal contributions to a variety of topics, including her work on party identification and the social identity components underlying it, which has been central in work of many people in our lab. But she has done a lot more work on female politicians, on nationalism, on public opinion towards war, to name just a selection. She has also been editing the handbook of Oxford Handbook of Political Psychology, which is a foundational piece of work for anybody interested in political psychology. I must say I'm a little biased because I had the honor to write a chapter in it, but I think it's true. Today, Leonie will give a talk on nationalism and party politics, and Leonie, yeah, we really admire your work, so we're very pleased that you found some time in this busy period, while you're also the department head at Stony Brook, to come and talk to us. I will keep my mouth shut and listen with all attention to your talk, and Diamantis will moderate the Q&A. For those of you who are new here today, you can ask your questions by typing them in the Q&A box, and then Diamantis will read out the question out loud, and Leonie will answer. The people in Amsterdam can raise their voice in collaboration or in negotiations with Diamantis. So without further ado, Leonie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, but thanks for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. And Bert is right. I mean, I have worked on nationalism and partisanship, and today I'm going to bring them together. So that's part of my interest, is to try and bring coherence to all of the things that I study. I see coherence. Hopefully you will too. And I want to thank the paper and the data that I'm going to talk about is also co-authored with Alessandro Del Ponte, who is a former Stony Brook PhD postdoc at Yale, soon to head to Alabama, and Jacob Martin, who is a graduate student at Stony Brook. So let me muse a little bit about this. Just trying to, what about nationalism and partisanship? And I think this question isn't just relevant to the US, it's also relevant in other places. We have seen a rise in nationalistic rhetoric, and I'll come back in a moment to define what I mean by nationalism. But certainly that is how the Trump presidency and his candidacy were described. There was a great emphasis on notions such as building a wall on the southern border to keep immigrants out of the United States, opposing amnesty for legal immigration, trade wars. In many ways, these are bedrock nationalistic issues. We've seen the same thing in Europe, and we've actually written a paper about how nationalism feeds into the opposition to the EU, and I'll refer to that on occasion, although I'm largely going to focus here on the US case. And so in 2016, it was pretty clear there was an association between the Republican Party and nationalistic policies. But this raises questions, certainly in the US context, about was this happening before Trump? And I think we all believe that there were indications in the Republican Party previous to Trump that allowed his ascendancy to be possible. So in some ways, maybe we can trace this back to the events, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, another one of my topics, terrorism, which I think pushed George Bush to articulate a form of nationalistic doctrine, this notion that American power should be used to transmit American values to other nations. As he said at the time, as George W. Bush said at the time after 9/11, America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. It's a kind of classic nationalistic statement. And then we saw evidence, further evidence in 2003 with the Iraq War, subsequent opposition to immigration in the Republican Party in the US. And Diana Mutz has documented that there has been declining Republican support over time for free trade, another hallmark of a nationalistic orientation. What's interesting is if I go back to one of my old papers from 2007 and look at the GSS data from 1996, there was no association between nationalism and partisanship at that time. So previous to 9/11, there wasn't this association. So we've clearly seen a rise. We think we see a rise here in the influence of nationalism in the US. And this to me is relevant also to the question of partisan polarization. To what extent we have a largely two-party system, to what extent is nationalism an overlooked factor that's also contributed to this rising polarization in the US. We focused on other factors, but not that, and I think that's a mistake. So hopefully I won't talk for too long. I know I don't have too long, but the questions that I'm interested in is first an important question about has nationalism in the public increased? When we've looked at Europe, and I'll come back to this, we're largely, initially at least, focusing on the International Social Science Program, ISSP data, which at 3 time points has had a very extensive battery of questions on national attachments, allowing us to look at the same measurement over incremental time periods. In the EU case, when we looked at Western Europe, we're looking at Western European nations using that ISSP data. There's no evidence that nationalism had actually increased in the public over time. Those are aggregate, that it's not panel data, it's just a series of cross sections, but no evidence. So that's the first question. The second question is, well, if it hasn't increased, has it increased in political importance? In other words, are we seeing a greater tie between voters' nationalism and support for a particular political party? And then the last piece of this that I'm going to tackle is an interesting question about whether nationalism appeals equally or has the same political appeal among white, Black, and Latino Americans. For various reasons, nationalism is a rather ethnocentric, often associated with an ethnocentric view of the nation. And so the first question is, do Blacks and Latinos hold nationalistic attitudes? And secondly, if the Republican Party is stressing nationalism, does it have equal appeal in terms of attracting minority supporters as well? So mostly I get interested in this because I'm very interested in the psychology of nationalism versus patriotism. In previous work, we've drawn this distinction very heavily. And I think it's an extremely important distinction. I'm writing in the new handbook that Bert alluded to, I'm writing a chapter on national attachments, and I'll stress very much that nationalism and patriotism are different, even though they're positively associated. So we'd say nationalism is linked to xenophobia, ethnocentrism, negative view of immigrants, and I think of it as a form of outgroup attitude. So it's us versus them. It's also linked much more strongly than patriotism to individual difference measures such as authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. Patriotism, on the other hand, could be described as positive feelings about the nation, sometimes love of country, and it is distinct from nationalism. I see it as linked to national identity. It's also linked to adherence to different norms. It can take different shapes depending on the nation, I think. This is one of the confusing things about patriotism. I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but the important thing is when I talk about nationalism, it is not the same as a love of country. It is definitely a sense of national superiority. That's the important point. And I'd say anyone who looks at this literature will get their head spins because nationalism is used in so many different ways. So I urge you, if you're using it, to use it in a similar way as we're using it here. And I'll fold in the concept of ethno-nationalism. There's a separate literature on this that has looked at civic versus ethno-nationalism, asking different questions. I'm folding that ethno-nationalism into nationalism, as you'll see. So first, let me just mention about the measurement. And again, if you're interested in this, the ISSP remains, these modules, the national identity modules remain by far the best measurement approach to this. They're really an excellent battery of items. There are 3 modules in the US. It's in 1996, 2004, 2014, roughly the same times in other nations. Our scale combines what we would consider to be the typical political psychology scale items, People are asked to agree or disagree with these questions. I'd rather be a citizen of this country than of any other country in the world. World will be a better place if people from other countries were more like us, and so on. But you'll also see that at the bottom here, I'm bringing in what are typically dealt with separately as sort of ethno-nationalism questions. What does it mean to truly belong to the country? Do you have to have been born there? Do you have to have lived most of your life in the country? Do you need to share ancestry? Do you need to be, in the case of the United States, Christian? In other countries, it might be the dominant religion. In this project, which is focusing on US data, but also in the European data, we've run measurement models on this. And we find that nationalism hangs together and is distinct from patriotism. I'm not showing you here questions on patriotism, they're measured differently. What I'd like you to look at is the bottom here. You can see when we create a scale, a 0 to 1 scale on nationalism, these levels don't look very different among white, Black, Latino, and other would include Asian Americans. If anything, Black Americans are slightly higher on nationalism. And again, this goes back to the notion that it's grounded to some extent in stable individual differences. That we in some of our analyses will control for patriotism too. The results I'll show you aren't different whether that's in or out here, but there is no difference. So it's hard to say that members of minority groups are any different. That is not the case for patriotism, however. Love of country does vary by minority groups. So this is something that looks common across these different groups. So we can answer that first question. Do members of minority groups hold nationalistic attitudes? The answer is yes, they do. So let's move on to the political effects. And what I'm going to show you here, please look at the right y-axis, not the left one, which is the scale for the histogram, underlying histogram. But these are audit probit analyses of the probability of being a Republican by year in the United States. The dark line, that black line, is 1996. It is slightly positive. So depending on which way we look at this, we can find no relationship or a modest relationship. But if you look at 2004 and 2014, looking at white Americans, you can see that there's a steep uptick in the link between being Republican and being highly nationalistic. So there's definitely been an increase over time. If you look at Black Americans in the second panel of this graph, of this slide, you can see that there is no relationship for Black Americans between being nationalistic and the probability of being Republican. It's either flat or slightly negative. So there is a big difference here between white and Black Americans in the relationship between being nationalistic and being Republican. So that's our first piece of evidence here, that has nationalism increased in political importance? Yes, the answer is yes. And while we can't pinpoint exactly how or why, certainly the 2004 data was collected after 9/11, when we've had an event that increased nationalistic rhetoric. Let me look at, so let's turn to a replication. So that's slight overtime data to suggest this has increased. Can we see this in other data if we look, especially these differences across racial and ethnic groups? And we can turn to Latinos. I haven't shown you Latinos in that ISSP data because it wasn't measured correctly in 1996. So I've looked at it in 2004 and 2014, but we can look at it more fully here. And here we're looking at ANES data from 2016 and 20, and voter study, a longstanding panel that was started in 12, beefed up around the time of 16, and has continued through to 2020 also. So unfortunately, we don't have as good measurement of nationalism here. So what we have in the ANES, even though I've been on the ANES board and argued mightily for more content, this is as far as I could get with it. So we have one of the sort of standard political psychology scales. It would be better if the rest of the world was more like America. And then these ethno-nationalism items about what's important to being truly American, being born, speaking English, sharing ancestry. And so those are the items we have in the ANES data in 16 and 20. The voter study is a panel. We only have these items once in 2016. It's a little more items here. There are some things about the country that make me ashamed. That's often been a negatively reverse worded item. I would rather be a citizen of this country than any other. The world would be a better place if there were more like this. And then again, the ancestry. What does it mean to be truly belong to the country, being born, living most of one's life, sharing ancestry? I want to show you again, this is just from voter study, that if you look at white, black, Hispanic, and other Americans, that nationalism again is, no lower among blacks and Hispanics than it is among white Americans. So again, that answers the question that nationalism, if we think of it as at least to some degree a stable individual difference, is hanging around there. And I would argue that every country has a bunch of people who would score more highly on nationalism. And really, as we've argued in our other paper about Europe, it's really about the activation of nationalism rather than its existence. And that brings us back to political rhetoric, that you can activate these people or they can be quiescent. And perhaps things get more obvious once the parties start to polarize around something like nationalism, that you're starting to see people sorting along that basis as well. So what does it look like in the voter study and the ANES, looking just at the probability of being Republican again? And again, look at the y-axis on the right-hand side. This is just voter study 16, ANES 16. You can see the dark line here is white Americans, steep relationship. Black Americans are the blue line at the bottom, totally flat. So no relationship. And what you do see is an interesting middling relationship with being among Latinos. So for Latino Americans, there is some relationship between, if you are nationalistic, you are more drawn to the Republican Party. And if you know anything about American politics, you know that Latinos do not vote uniformly as strongly as African Americans do for the Democratic Party. In any election, 60-something% of Latinos will vote for the Democrats, but that leaves many who vote for Republicans. We had a lot of discussion about that in 2020 with what appeared to be some uptick in Latino support for the Republican Party. And so it looks, at least to some degree, that some of this is predicated on this nationalistic rhetoric, that it is attracting highly nationalistic Latinos as well. So let me then say, we have a couple of panels here, and I'm running through this quickly, but so what's what? Can we sort through this? This is not an experiment. This is looking at existing attitudes in the population by these different groups. What you can see on the left-hand side is the voter study, and this is from 2016 to 2020. It's just the 7-point partisanship scale from 20 with 16 subtracted. Now, we don't expect much change here, and keep focused on the 0 line. That would be where you just stayed the same. A positive change is a shift towards the Republican Party. So you can see on average, there was a little bit of a jump up between 16 and 20, at least in voter study. That is not the case in the ANES. So go back and forth and look. Again, we've got two different styles of surveys here. We can talk about how they collect their data and why they might look different. What you can see on the other side is the 0 line. There's some decrease and some increase. So if you look at the ANES side, the black and green lines are the whites and Latinos. If you're low in nationalism, you maybe have become more Democratic. If you're higher in nationalism, you've become a little more Republican. And these are just individual difference scores. And for African Americans, not so much going on. I should add that you're going to come back and ask me, is it really nationalism? If I put ideology into these equations, it is nationalism and not ideology that's driving this. So there really is something particular to nationalism that's pulling highly nationalistic whites and Latinos further over to the Republican side between 16 and 20. And that might be surprising because it's Trump the whole time. So, but also Trump with that constant nationalistic rhetoric. So perhaps it gets through increasingly over time to people who haven't been paying much attention. But again, African Americans are quite immune. So what's going on? I mean, this is what we're looking at here is to what extent racial and ethnic identity holds people in place and leads them to resist this appeal to nationalism. So again, this is the probability of being Republican. The histogram is nationalism underneath, so you can't see racial ID distributions. But what I'll tell you for the African Americans, for the Blacks, is that there are not very many people at the not important level. This question is, how important is being Black or African American to you? How personally important is it? It's not important, it's moderately important, extremely important. And you can see on the left-hand side for Blacks, if your racial identity, which is most people, is moderately or extremely important, you are not moving in the Republican direction, no matter how nationalistic you are. So it's holding people in place. For the few people, and it's about 5% who say it's not important to them, then nationalism does play more of a role. You can see here, and this is in fact significant. These are all significant differences based on the degree of racial identity. If you look at Latinos on the other side, and again, this is voter study, you can see that if you, and for them, there's maybe 25% of people who say their racial identity is not very important to them. Nationalism is much more relevant to becoming Republican. You can see that that's a fairly steep positive slope. If you say it's extremely important being Hispanic or Latino, nothing. You know, again, nationalism is not relevant to you. So it's holding you in place as most likely a Democrat. So this is some evidence that what's going on is that these group or ethnic racial identities are preventing people from enacting this nationalism, which is there. You know, we've demonstrated it's there. It's just not being politically activated for them because they're being held in place by their racial or ethnic identity and sticking to the Democratic Party. And this is the ANES data, which looks pretty similar. This is the same thing, Blacks and Latinos in the 2016 data. So same sort of finding, it's a similar question. Racial identity is holding people in place, but if that weakens, then people are free to translate nationalism into support for the Republican Party. So I know, I think I'm doing okay in time, but for me, there are a number of interesting implications for this. So first, I think we can say, I'm saying, and you can prove me wrong, but I think that nationalism hasn't increased over time if we measure it this way. There's no evidence for that. What has changed is the political relevance to partisan politics. And this is most pronounced at the moment among white Americans. Black and Latino Americans are nationalistic, and I haven't shown you this, but nationalism in other work that we've published, nationalism has the same kind of other consequences for Blacks and Latinos. It drives anti-immigration policy. It drives, to some extent, maybe more weakly, opposition to free trade. So it's not like it doesn't mean the same thing, it does. But these ethnic and racial identity prevent Blacks and Latinos from translating this into partisanship to the extent to which they identify with their group. So this raises some interesting questions. Is it possible for the Republican Party, I'm not advocating for the Republican Party to do this, but it seems to me they could see the same kind of data. Is it possible for them to attract Black and Latino nationalists? Trump would occasionally try. He would appeal to Black Americans by saying, what's the Democratic Party ever done for you? He didn't really try so hard with Latinos, who he called rapists and criminals, but he did make some overtures to Black Americans. And some people thought there might have been a little bit of an effect among some. Is it possible, for example, for not only the Republican Party, but a European party to support Blacks and Latinos and other minority groups by saying, well, you're here and you're great, and we're looking after you, but we're not letting any others coming in, and we are going to crush other nations or whatever it is. So can you actually develop such an ideology that it is really nefarious? But you can imagine a political party thinking, if they were smart, they'd be thinking, okay, how do I do this? How do I peel this off so that we have this highly nationalistic but more inclusive internally kind of ideology. I don't even know if that's possible. We can argue about the nature of nationalism and whether that's even possible. And that leads me to that last question about, is there some inherent tension between nationalism and domestic ethnic and racial inclusion? I think we see in the US that not necessarily, if we look at Latinos, that there is some opening there for a nationalistic party to attract them if they're not as aligned with their ethnic group. So anyway, I think that this, while I focused on the US, I think that this has relevance to other places. And it's got very much to do with how parties operate and how they exploit these pre-existing proclivities of the public. And so I'm going to stop sharing my slides and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Professor Huddy. This was a very, very interesting presentation with a lot of data that comes back from 2016 and over. So thank you very much. This is very enlightening. So I'd like to give the floor to questions that might exist here in our panel in Amsterdam, or like from participants who follow this virtually. But before doing so, perhaps I can already start by asking a small clarification question. So you started your talk by saying that this sort of terrorism rhetoric is what's been pushing leaders towards more nationalistic values and political rhetoric in principle. Was that correct? And do you think that this example represents like a more global sort of tendency or phenomena, or is it just like bind to U.S. politics?
I mean, this is a supposition. Obviously, I can't demonstrate that these events, 9/11, but we certainly saw a rise in reaction to that. I think it fueled concerns about Muslim migration, even to the U.S., which hasn't been a major issue, but that also became more paramount in discussions of immigration. And I think if we look to Europe, it may be even more intense. In Europe, this tight association between immigration and terrorism. In the US, it's a bit more of a mixed bag. I think Trump tried by calling Latinos criminals. It was sort of like because that's a much more visible ethnic migrant group to the US, he tried to bring in violence and criminality. So it's probably a little more, it's always a little more complex than that. But I do think my view on this is that politicians exploit these situations and that there may be underlying agendas that they can then pursue, that these events provide opportunities to try out different kinds of rhetoric to see what has traction. And it's not always clear that this would have had the same traction in the past. There may be a time, and I think we've speculated endlessly about populism and right-wing political parties, but what exactly is it that allows these parties to emerge? So if someone can resolve that definitively, that would be great. But I think it's a tough question. I mean, it is a tough question. And I don't think, again, my view is it's not the public that's changing so much. Given our views of political psychology, it's not so much that they're changing, is that, parties can peel them off in different ways, sort them out in different ways by developing different lines of rhetoric.
All right, thank you. Yes, Christian has a question here.
Thank you a lot for the presentation. It was super interesting. I was wondering, did you have a look at what's the role of economic background here when it comes to—
Can you speak up a little bit? I'm going to try and put my speaker up a bit more. Someone's doing this is the time when all our leaves are getting blown outside. So this is happening today when the guy is there with the leaf blower. So shout.
No problem. Do you have any idea what's the role of economic background here, especially how economic background might relate to racial identity and yeah, that differs?
Okay, so yeah, no, I mean, so if we step back from nationalism and look, I was saying that it has a sort of individual difference basis, but there's also an education link to nationalism. So less educated people, I mean, and that's probably more important. I'm just going to look here at what I've got, but I think that's a little more important even than economics. We have looked at, I have a book chapter, so I'm just looking now. income and education, but education, I think, has the bigger effect. So less wealthy people are also likely to be nationalistic. Now, these attitudes, okay, so we've looked endlessly at things like immigration policy in the US and immigration attitudes. To what extent is it economic? And we can never find it. I think research has been done elsewhere on this. We've looked obsessively. The only time that people can find is when it's a very, very specific type of immigrant that will specifically affect your type of a job. So it's less clear that it's purely economic in nature. I think, the effects I'm looking now, let's see, authoritarianism probably has a bigger effect on this than economics. I'm looking back at I have this book chapter, I'm looking at my table, yeah, it looks like it. So, and that's not just in our data. That I was mentioning the Osborne-Sibley paper. It's a political psychology paper where they looked at this in New Zealand. And these trends are remarkably similar in different countries.
And Isabella had a question also.
Thanks a lot for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm wondering about the descriptive results you showed, where you showed that African Americans report higher levels of nationalism, or kind of very high levels. And I thought that was surprising. I'm wondering, kind of prominently, Barack Obama was always accused of not being a true American. I'm wondering how much you think African Americans could over-report their nationalism because they might feel a pressure to prove that they're truly American.
Yeah, so I mentioned that we've also looked at patriotism. In another paper, we look at both, and African Americans are lower in patriotism. So that's an interesting puzzle. So that's the more typical finding, that members of minority groups in many countries around the world will report lower levels of attachment to the nation. So the fact that we get that's what makes nationalism interesting, is in fact we get slightly, no, it's slightly higher even after controlling for education. There's a slight positive relationship between being Black and being more nationalistic. I don't have an answer for that. It's an interesting question we'd have to delve into. I understand why African Americans would report lower patriotism. Some of the questions are also terrible for this. If you look at the ISSP battery, it will be, how proud do you feel of your country's treatment of minority groups? Well, this is obviously a difficult question. Or proud of this, that, and the other. So that tends to push down pride. But this idea that our country is better, maybe a compensation, like we're, even though our country's screwed up, we are still a great country, like I think we're better than the others. So I think that that's an interesting puzzle. I'm not making too much out of that, but the major point for me is it's not lower.
There are other questions. Heis has a question.
Yes.
Hi, Leonie. Thanks for your talk. I was wondering, quite often people make distinctions between civic and ethnic nationalism. Is that something you're looking at as well?
This is my complaint about the literature. So I'm going to enter into a diatribe here about how we've had these two literatures that have gone off in different directions. And so we've been doing these measurement models that ISSP battery has both sets of items in it. So if you look at it, they're also in there. This is what does it make to be a truly good blank? A truly good American. Is that someone who's born in the country? These are asked in many countries. When we look at it in our measurement model, it loads with all the nationalism items. Really, it's a tight structure. I mean, I know these develop differently. These concepts of civic versus ethno-national were really developed for different nations, right? It was a way to try and describe different cultures, different political ideologies, different histories. But in truth, they've been used internally, right, to try and sort people out. And I think, civic, I call it civic patriotism. Okay, so civic patriotism to one side, but these other items on ethno-nationalism are just nationalism by another word. You know, we can debate what we should be calling it. So I know Jack Citron, who's a friend of mine, will kill me because he really strongly believes that this is an independent line of research, but I have to differ. You know, the measurement stuff is pretty clear. And I should add that we've also looked at the invariance of the structure of patriotism, nationalism, which is invariant across our racial and ethnic groups. So we looked at that in a measurement model context. So it's not like it doesn't go together differently for different groups either. So if you have some of your friends who are studying this, let's try to bring them together. I know they'll never listen to us. They'll never listen to it. The comparative politics are like, oh no, this is totally different.
Leonard.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation.
No, you have to shout. You really have to shout.
Thank you, Leonie, for your amazing presentation. I have a question. In one of your first slides, you showed how the Republican Party became more nationalist during the last 20 years. How would you say responded the Democratic Party to that? Is also nationalism more important part of the Democratic Party nowadays?
I mean, I think, you know, you would not say that the Democrats are nationalistic. I mean, part of this, if you wind it back, if we think back to foreign policy, we had under the Bush administration, when Obama came in, remember Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and we said, oh, finally, we're back to proper diplomacy and foreign policy. Remember this? And then there was Trump and they were like, oh, finally, we're back to talking to other nations again. So we've gone through this herky-jerky thing. But the Republicans are always emphasizing, no, it's our way or the highway. It seems to be the general line, you know, that it's US interests first and foremost. And we're not chatting with people. We're pulling out of the Iranian deal where, you know, we just don't really care. Now, I know Biden got some of this flack over the Afghanistan pullout. But in general, I think there is a much less hard-edged tone. If there is one, it's like maybe China right now. So China is a more specific topic, but it is not a general form of nationalism. So is that answering? I'm not sure I got all of it, but is that your question? Is about whether the Democrats are also highly nationalistic in rhetoric?
Yeah, whether there are spillover effects as response to that, but you perfectly answered that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you follow foreign policy very closely, you know, the State Department, people in the State Department cry when the Republicans come in and they're like happy when the Democrats come back because it's sort of back to normal diplomacy. Right? I mean, they're like it's tragic when the Republicans, because every people leave under Trump, a lot of them just left. It's like it's a dead enterprise. I mean, you must feel that over there. I mean, you're seeing it from the other side, you know. So I think, you know, and what's happening, of course, we don't know. Polarization, the partisan polarization probably is like an amplifying effect on all of this as well. But I want to underscore that it seems weird to me that we haven't properly focused on nationalism as an ingredient in all of this. It seems like a huge omission. It's been just ignored and poorly measured, and all of my complaints about nationalism is just sort of being a leftover concept.
Thank you. Do I see any other questions here? No, not necessarily. I know that Bert has a question on the other side of the line, so let me pass the floor over. Bert?
Yeah, and let me also, there's somebody in this Zoom, Matthijs. But now I have the word, so I'm going to ask my question anyways. Thanks, Leonie, for this exciting talk. I was thinking for a moment it was Stanley who was mowing the lawn, but it was. My question is this: it relates. So Ashley Jardina's book on white racial resentment has obviously made a big impact on the understanding of sort of the dynamics in American politics. But what you seem to describe is a separate mechanism, right? But I'm wondering, to what extent among the whites is among the whites nationalism and white racial resentment the same, but then where the unique component comes in is where you show that you can mobilize especially the Latino in that direction of the Republican Party? Is that where the two lines are diverging, or do you say, well, they're also the line among the whites, nationalism is something different than this white racial resentment, or is there some conceptual overlap? And would there be ways of empirically teasing it apart? Because if I remember, I should know this because I was in the committee reading Ashley's book for an award, but I forgot the exact wording of the items she uses. But is it partly the same item wording, or are they distinct wordings and items? So because then you would be able to tease it apart partly empirically.
A good question. The question, what we do have, which I think is very similar to one of Ashley's questions, is the importance of being white. You saw that I was showing you the racial importance question. That's also there for whites. It's much more strongly aligned with nationalism for whites. It's not the case for African Americans or for Latinos, but it is for white Americans. And so it's clearly this nationalism has taken on these white overtones, right? Even though Blacks and Latinos share this and have resonance with some of it, that's really the dilemma, right? It's like if you push hard on it's just whites for whom this works, then it's exclusive. So we should look at, I've looked at ideology, I should look more closely and tease out the white identity. If we put white identity in, it doesn't do anything for nationalism because it's just too strongly related. It's not conditional, they're just interrelated concepts. And so I think we need to tease this part. This is a work in progress, by the way. So, so we need to, we've got to bulletproof it, I think, a little more to say, but I think our novel, and you may be right, Bert, that all of this is rolled together. When we study partisanship and the polarization in the US, everything is rolled together. It's unbelievably difficult to study this in cross-sectional format. It's frighteningly difficult. But I think we've got at least a small angle on this with the members of the minority, racial, and ethnic groups to sort of demonstrate that. So I'll think a little bit more about that, about what we can do and tell that story, because I'm not sure it's a different story in one sense. It just helps to flesh out who, what comes first, right? This is the interesting question. Does white identity come first, or is this nationalism a more foundational concept?
Yes, and I'm obviously not an American politics scholar per se, but I think this mobilization of the minorities and especially the Latinos, that's an important phenomena with interest, right? Because there it can definitely not be white racial resentment, right? It would be that would be weird or confusing to me.
Yeah.
So for them, it's the mobilization on nationalism, I guess.
Yep. Yeah.
Would that not, but I'm not just thinking out loud, if it's given that it's a work in progress, would that not call for some sort of experimental design where you would measure nationalism in a wave 1 and then in a wave 2 propose some politicians that with more or less nationalistic rhetoric to see if that activates the more nationalist parts of your survey, and maybe even subset that among the different ethnic groups?
One of my graduate students is working on that right now, but
excellent. Yeah, that's great.
He's Latino by background. He's very interested in the Latinos in this. So
yeah.
So he's working on a design right now to test that very idea. So I think that's amenable. I mean, it is amenable, especially since we think this is a dynamic situation and it's linked to rhetoric. So it's a great suggestion.
Yeah. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Diamantis again. You're muted, Diamantis. You're muted.
Thank you, Bert. Since we have little time left and 2 more questions, it's nice to also hear what Professor Huddy has to tell us about that. So there's a short question by Tobias Rohrbach, who is asking about intersections between the multiple social categories that you might see in the data. For example, the role of gender or ethnicity, race.
That's an interesting question. So what we would find is, you know, in the data we've looked at in the US, women are slightly more nationalistic and less patriotic for whatever reason. But my experience in trying to, let's say, break out our racial groups further, if it's a question about intersectionality between gender and race, is that we often don't find anything. You know, if I look at race and I look at gender, they're often independent effects. Now it becomes difficult to fully divide up in these samples. We don't have a lot of Black or Latino participants in these surveys. They're large, but they're not that large. So that makes it a little challenging. But in past work that I've done looking at, let's say, interactions between gender and race and ethnicity, I found nothing. I understand it's a very popular concept, but we need more evidence that this is really happening, you know, that there really are distinctive outlooks among female African Americans compared to male African Americans on these issues. There may be on other issues, but on these political issues, it's hard to find, especially with partisanship, group loyalties, and so on.
Right. Thank you for this. There is another question from Matthijs wrote down. Thank you for this interesting presentation. The question is about the activation of nationalism. We know that also in many European countries, exclusionistic forms of nationalism haven't really increased over the years. An often heard explanation for the success of far-right parties is, and that is in line with your own argument, that political rhetoric has activated these attitudes and made them consequential for voting behavior. This could imply that increased salience of other topics will diminish the effect of nationalism again. Focusing on the Republican Party, do you think that a strategy of becoming more inclusive could also backfire for Republicans? After all, this could also make white Republicans less likely to vote Republican Party, as the nationalism might then be deactivated.
I mean, interesting question. So first, let me say something about Europe, because we wrote a paper recently, it was in political psychology. So I urge whoever's asking that question to read it, because I think it answers that question about the presence of what we classified as a right-wing, well, I call them nationalistic parties. I've got my own feelings about populism, and we could talk about that later, but I call them nationalistic parties, that a stronger party increased the relationship, in this case, between nationalism and EU opposition. So the question here was, and in countries without that sort of party, nationalism was more inert. So nationalism was there in other countries, but without the presence of one of these parties, it wasn't being translated into EU opposition. And interestingly, we found that these effects were greatest among the best educated individuals. So those who are highly nationalistic and well-educated were the first to seemingly pick up this rhetoric and understand that, that they can translate this nationalism into both EU opposition and also support for the far-right parties. So there's clearly, we have some evidence there that the presence of the parties and their popularity enhanced these effects. To go back to the US, what's the strategy in the US? I mean, right now, the Republican Party, if you observe the country, is doing everything it can to try and win elections by cooking the books, if you will. They are facing a changing electorate. Now, if you look at what I just presented and you're Republican, you'd say, well, maybe there's some hope there to attract Latino supporters, and I don't need to do a whole lot. But if you look at the demographics, the country is becoming increasingly diverse, which is, I think, why you're seeing so much effort placed into restricting voter rights and so on to try and prevent people from voting. So the Republicans face a challenge. Now, yes, if they became more inclusive, what might happen? They're going at some point to have to appeal to Black and Latino voters. I mean, it's just an impossibility. You cannot win if you keep looking at these demographics. You can't win. But maybe this kind of angle that we're looking at here, this nationalistic angle, could work if you soft pedal a little bit of it, do something on immigration for the people already in the US. Do it, maybe keep the rhetoric high and the actions less visible, you know, so that you're speaking to segmented aspects of your population. What you have right now is a lock. The Republicans have a lock on basically white Christian evangelicals. they're not going anywhere, and they're really very, very devoted voters. So they're holding the party together. If you look at what's happening now, as we discussed, the abortion case in the Supreme Court in the US is exactly that cup of tea. That's what they're looking for. And so, the party can work on multiple fronts. So I think, you wouldn't just go wholesale, become a Democratic Party, but there may be nefarious strategies that you can employ to signal to one group separately from another. So I don't know if that answers the question. I'm not trying to shape the Republican Party, but I do think it's healthier for democracy to have, two viable parties, that can actually, trade voters and so on. So.
Thank you. And there's a last question before time runs out, and I'll have to pass the floor to Bert. It comes from Sana van Oosten. In her research, she finds a lot of evidence for civilizationism, which is a specific form of nationalism in which people argue their civilization is better because of being in favor of issues such as free speech, democracy, homosexuality, and gender equality. Do you see any tendencies towards this in your research?
That's not the nature that the direction that nationalism has taken in the US, but you can imagine that someone who is highly nationalistic on the left could go for something like this, right? I mean, it is possible. What we're seeing in the US is nationalism being pulled to the right. But what I was saying, back in the 90s, there wasn't so much of a relationship. So at that point, it was up for grabs to some extent. I could be a left-wing politician and decide to develop an anti-immigration, anti-free trade, protect the population sort of argument, and that could be folded into that. You can see that the questions themselves are pretty agnostic as to direction. It's just, my country's better, we're a superior group of people. So I think, it is possible to poach it on the left or right. It just, we just happen to be in a moment where everyone's being pulled to the right.
Right, thank you. Thanks a lot, Professor Huddy. The time is 5 to 4, and that means I'll have to pass the floor to Bert for some last-minute announcements.
Yeah, and Leonie, I'm going to ask you one generic question. We have a lot of young people in our lab and also in listening in. If you would give them one advice as somebody with an overview of the field, like one career advice, like what should they be thinking about, or what is a good thing to do, or something they should definitely not do? It's a very general question, but I was
very general question.
No, but I know you've been known to mentor a lot of people in the field for many years. So I was just curious about what are some of the best advice if you want to succeed as a political psychologist.
And in my advice is maybe not the right advice, maybe it's old-fashioned advice, but I always say people should be really interested in what you're doing. Like, you should be very interested, you should read about it, you should think about it, you should, I would say traveling is very helpful, go exploring, think about the world, and that's it. I know I get, you maybe not the same in Netherlands, but in the US I get this very professional advice. Like, do this and do that and do something else, and that's how you're going to succeed. But if you don't love what you're doing and you don't find it interesting, forget it. Go do something else. So that's what I always say. And I mean, it's, find interesting topics. If you're bored by them, so will everyone else be when you write about them. Right? I mean, that's it. Like, if you're bored by it, like, how can you possibly transmit interest and enthusiasm? So I mean, the world we live in a fascinating, as much as it's a crazy, strange world, it's a very fascinating world. And humans are really complicated animals. Bert was alluding to animals, but humans are far more difficult to study than other animals. I don't know why I ended up in this direction and not that one, but anyway, it's been an interesting career.
Leonie, thank you very much for this fascinating talk and also this last bit of career advice. I'm gonna use the last minute to announce that next week is our last meeting of the year. We have Frederik Hopp, who will be defending his PhD the evening before he gives the talk in the Hot Politics Lab. And just mind you, he will defend his PhD at University of California, Santa Barbara, while he's in Amsterdam. So that will be a big time difference for him. But he will join us on Friday to talk about some of his political neuroscience work. And Gijs and I have been putting together the program for the Spring Speaker Series, and just a couple of names that we are excited about to announce is that Dana Young from the University of Delaware will speak, Nathalie Giger from the University of Geneva, Christoph van Eck, who we just hired at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research on climate change, Josh Kala from Yale will give a talk, Arvid Kappas from the University of Bremen. So a bunch of exciting speakers from various fields with various methods, and we'll be filling up our list in the coming days. So we hope to see some of you as long as it can last in Amsterdam, and otherwise virtually in the Zoom environment. But thanks a lot again, Leonie. I believe you still had 50 minutes of time for some informal mentoring, and wish all of you a happy Sinterklaas weekend, because that's what we do in our ceremony. Sinterklaas is sort of our nationalist tradition, right? So enjoy that, and I'll see you all next week again.
And thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Great.